Hey folks, it's Dr. G, and I am here to give you information about research methods and start lecturing on finishing up survey research and then talking about case studies and observational research. So hopefully you received this document that I sent you earlier in the week. I did want to add a couple of things. It turns out that the American Psychological Association during the pandemic will actually be allowing free access to the 7th publication manual, so the 7th edition. So if you're having issues with APA formatting when you're working on your papers, this is a really good opportunity to have that document with you so you can remember how to cite according to the 7th edition. Even though it's not a huge part of your paper grade, it is still accounting for about 30% of it, so do take it seriously. So I just wanted to alert you to a couple of things that you'll need to kind of focus on this week. So be starting to read Chapter 7 in Morling. I'm going to finish up observational research, and I will start talking about selecting samples later in the week. There should be some overlap with what we talked about with surveys. But what I'd like you to do, this will be due on Tuesday, March 31st. I would like you to find the results of an opinion poll of your choice. So go ahead and find that online. Print out the results. Obviously, you're not going to be able to print it out, but tell me the results of the poll or give me a link to the results of the poll and provide me with any information that you can find about these different types of polling methods. Your 6th quiz will post on Friday, March 27th. It will be due the following Friday at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And then on Thursday, April 2nd, your next introduction draft is due. We are going to peer review, but I'd like you to find 2 other people in the class who can put their eyes on your work. Please send me a link to the document with peer-reviewed comments on it, as well as a finished document with no review comments on it. So that's just what I wanted to kind of let you know about before we started going into survey research. So we're going to talk a little bit. We've just got a little bit more left for survey research. I thought it was important to cover that. So here are some things that you need to think about when you hear about a poll's results or a particular survey. If there's anything that ever makes you question what you're reading, these are questions that help you engage your critical thinking skills, and it'll help you figure out whether or not the data from this survey actually mean anything. So first of all, who conducted it? And why did they conduct it? So if we find that like 30% of, or 30 to 40% of people find orange juice part of an important breakfast, but it was funded by the Florida Orange Council, we should probably raise our eyebrows a little bit. Did the survey utilize probability sampling? What were the methods that were used to obtain the sample? Are we looking only at landline telephone users? Is this something that's happening on the internet? And again, even internet surveys can be an issue because not everybody has good internet access. Were the questions appropriate? Are they leading? And are the interpretations from the survey or polling data appropriate? So when we pull up information, for example, from the 2020 census, we've got a pretty good reason to believe that this is a pretty good sample. This is about getting demographic information about the people in the United States. This is being sent out to a large majority of people, and you are required by law to take care of it. If you don't, people will follow up with you until you do. So we can probably trust something like the census. Other types of surveys will need to really utilize our critical thinking skills and ask ourselves these questions. Now, something that we have to watch out for in particular are what are known as fake surveys. These are either through marketing techniques or different political campaigns, and they're basically ways of manipulating people or marketing to people that are basically pretending to be a survey. And so we have two different types. We have what is referred to as sugging, which is selling people something under the guise of research. So maybe I call you up and I go, how are you feeling about your vacuum cleaner these days? Do you feel like it gets the job done? How long have you had it? What brand is it? And then I ask you all of these survey questions, and I'm basically using that for a sales pitch to sell you a new type of vacuum. So this would be a case of sugging. I'm selling under the guise of research. Now, likewise, a very similar sort of thing is what is called frugging. This is fundraising under the guise of research. So we give people a fake survey, basically using that as a means to help raise funds. And one of the ways that you'll kind of see these fake surveys in particular are with political campaigns, which are often referred to as push polls. We call them push polls because they are basically designed to push you towards a particular candidate. So I'm going to show you a very satirical clip from the Colbert Report from 2008 that actually gives you a ludicrous example of a push poll, but there is kind of a reason that I'm showing it. So very, very quickly, let's go ahead and take a look at this clip.
Yes. Okay. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. Just one last question. Do you strongly agree, strongly disagree, or have no opinion about the following statement? I would continue to support Senator McCain for president if I learned he had fathered an illegitimate Asian baby. Okay, good, okay. How about this? An illegitimate pirate baby. Well, that's very open-minded of you, ma'am. Okay. How about a legitimate Nazi baby? Yeah, one of the, like Ava Braun or somebody like that. Yeah, yeah, that would be bad, wouldn't it? That would be bad. Okay, good. Okay, listen, I gotta go. Vote your conscience. Bye-bye. Sorry about that, folks. I was just doing a little quick, thank you. I was just doing some push polling for my friend Mike Huckabee.
Okay, so this is a very silly clip, obviously, talking about an illegitimate pirate baby and things like that. But as it actually turns out, that little joke that was made in 2008 actually has a historical basis. So this was actually something kind of interesting. In the year 2000, when the Republican primaries were happening, it was supposedly alleged that George W. Bush's campaign actually used push polling against the late Senator John McCain. So John McCain was the presidential candidate in 2008, but he also ran for president in the year 2000. Interestingly enough, it was reported that voters in South Carolina were asked, would you be more likely or less likely to vote for John McCain for president if you knew that he had fathered an illegitimate black child? So this is a very kind of leading sort of question, and because of that, it strongly suggests and it strongly pushes voters to make a different choice rather than truly giving their opinion. So push polls often make use of leading questions that are basically designed to manipulate you like that. So now we're going to move on and briefly talk about case studies and observational research. So as we kind of saw with surveys, surveys are what we would consider a descriptive method of research. So in these particular instances, we are describing the attitudes, the behaviors, of people around us. So we can do that with a survey. Another descriptive method that we can actually use are what are known as case studies as well as observational research. Now, your book doesn't really spend a lot of time talking about case studies. I won't necessarily either, but they are an important form of descriptive research that can be incredibly useful and incredibly helpful for understanding different types of instances of behavior. So, what are case studies? So, case studies are basically in-depth descriptive analyses of a person, a particular social unit, or of some type of event. So, how are we often collecting data in case studies? Well, so one of the things that we're doing is we are potentially directly observing people. So we pick a particular person or a group of people. We follow them around for a little while. Questioning and interviewing is often the most common thing that we see as well. And in particular, depending on the type of case study that we're doing, diagnostic measures may also be used as well. And you can kind of see from these images that I'm showing you that probably, at least in my field of study, where we tend to see case studies tend to happen most is with people that have brain damage. Now, obviously, we can't go into randomly select a group of people and then damage their brains. That would be incredibly unethical. But what we can do if we want to learn more about the brain and how it works is by looking at people who already have damage and see what they can do and what they can't. So probably one of the most famous known examples in my subfield is the case of HM, who had his medial temporal lobes removed to treat intractable epilepsy. And what we ended up learning from this particular case study is that the hippocampus is really critical for long-term memory formation. And so HM was given a variety of different types of diagnostic tests, memory measures. Here is a case where he was actually asked to map out his house and the floor plan of his house, and he actually does a pretty good job of it. And it's because of this that we learn a lot about what we can do, or what the brain can do, and what it can't do when certain areas are damaged. We can also look at different types of social groups. So if you're interested in social psychology, if you're interested in sociology or anthropology, oftentimes we can do case studies for particular groups of people as well. So why do we do case studies? Case studies can help provide a great amount of detail regarding very rare abilities or disorders that are typically not common in the general population. And oftentimes they can help us get insight into similar sorts of cases. And they also help us understand the different causes of behavior. They may provide evidence for and help clarify different theories or different hypotheses, and they're also a very strong source of external validity. So rather than putting somebody into an artificial laboratory scenario, which has very little external validity, we are instead looking at how these people are navigating their daily lives, and as such, it translates very highly into a real-world scenario that has a lot of external validity. Now, what are some of the problems with case studies? Well, again, we're not manipulating anything. We're only describing and measuring what is already present. And because of that, it can be really difficult to make causal inferences. Additionally, for certain types of behavior in certain groups or individuals, there may be multiple potential causes, and it can be really hard to tease those apart. Findings may not generalize well. Case studies often involve very small groups of people, maybe one at the minimum, maybe a particular group at the largest. And because of that, that may not necessarily generalize. even with lesion studies, we can look at different people that have damage to the hippocampus, and they don't always look the same because the damage is not the same across participants. Now, one of the other things that we have to watch out for is what is known as observer bias. And even in observational research of any kind, this is something to be mindful of and something to prepare for. Your expectations are potentially going to distort how you observe things. So if you're doing a case study on somebody with schizophrenia and you find that they have a hobby, for example, they're really, really into comic books. If you know that they have schizophrenia ahead of time, you may potentially view the comic book obsession through the lens of schizophrenia and use that as additional evidence to show that this is a symptom of this person's disorder. And it may not be. Additionally, you may engage in confirmation bias. You may only pay attention to the evidence that supports your claims, and you may choose to ignore any behavior that doesn't really fit with those claims. So now we're going to move on and talk about observational research. So here's kind of what we're going to cover here this week. We're going to talk about the basic principles of observation, including the purpose of observational research. We'll talk about 3 different types of observational research, including naturalistic observation, participant observation, and structured observation. We're going to talk about how to best record observations, and I'll also highlight some potential pitfalls that you have to watch out for when you're engaged in this type of research. So what is observational research? Observational research is basically any type of research study in which a behavior or types of behaviors are systematically watched and recorded. So we don't just watch for the sake of watching, we plan ahead of time. We have target behaviors that we are looking to identify, and we are very intentional in this observation. So that systematic aspect is key. So we're going to watch and record this behavior. This can usually occur, we may be watching the behavior of multiple people or animals, as you can see here is the case for the great Jane Goodall. And additionally, this can occur in real time or by reviewing records. It could be looking at census data over the past 50 years. It could be looking at video recordings or audio recordings. You can look at qualitative aspects of observation, so you can describe the behaviors that you're seeing and look for patterns. You can do quantitative research, so you can look for the frequency of different types of behaviors, or you can do what is called a mixed methods approach, in which you can do both of these things. Now, I'm going to get into a pretty well-known study that I first heard about when I was a teaching assistant in graduate school. So in graduate school, yeah, I have a grad school story for you. I figure you kind of miss those a little bit. So when I was in grad school, I was a teaching assistant for research methods with the same instructor for a period of about 4 or 5 semesters in a row. And so one of the things that she would make the class do when we talked about research ethics was they had to pick a list of 5 different papers that she gave them the option of looking at. They had to pick one of those 5, and they had to identify and address the ethical issues of this research. So I first heard about this study when I was in graduate school, and I cannot believe that this was a study that was ever done. So this is a study that was performed in 1976 by Middlemiss, Knowles, and Matter. And it was basically an observational study that looked at personal space violations in the men's bathroom. So I will go ahead and put the PDF of this article online for you later on this week if you're interested in reading it. I'm going to give you a basic summary of the study, and I'm also going to briefly show you a blog post. So these researchers were interested in what would happen if you violated a man's personal space in the bathroom while they were at a urinal, engaged in the process of what they referred to as micturition. We're just going to go ahead and call that urination because that's what it is. And so basically what they would do is they would have an observer that was basically hiding in one of the stalls that basically recorded the placement of the urinals. So if one man was urinating at a urinal, they would look at how close men were to each other. And they also recorded the onset and the offset of urination. So this was a pilot. And then in the actual study, what they would do was they would have a Confederate. The Confederate would basically come up next to a man at a urinal, and they would vary the number of urinals between the man who was urinating and the Confederate to see if that would change the onset and the offset of urination. So they utilized a Confederate to kind of systematically vary personal space violations, and the observers basically hiding in the stall, viewing the visual cues, so they're actually looking at the stream of urine using a periscope. There is so much wrong with this study, folks, and it is incredibly unethical. But one of the things that I think is kind of important is that even though, and I would say, let's not lose sight of the fact that this is a highly unethical study. This is a case where you're observing people, and I mean, odds are pretty good that you probably would not be able to get somebody's permission to do this. So you would possibly have to do this without obtaining consent. So the larger thing is that it's incredibly unethical, but you almost kind of have to admire the amount of detail and the use of different types of observations that Middlemist and colleagues actually did for this study. So I want to briefly look at this blog post. And so this is on SciBlog. It's called Don't Stand So Close to Me. Oh my. To gather some preliminary data on men's toilet habits, a pilot study stationed an observer in a public toilet at a U.S. university. He was instructed to look like he was grooming himself in the mirror. He was actually keeping a record of which urinals men stood at and their patterns of urination. Timing them on his wristwatch, our intrepid toilet researcher measured the onset delay in micturition along with persistence of flow. If you're wondering how our correspondent measured it, it was by sound, which must have been no mean feat when there was multiple micturition in progress. The pilot study revealed men prefer not to stand next to each other in the urinals, and the closer other men are to each other, the longer it takes for them to begin urinating and the shorter the persistence of their stream. So then they bring out the periscope. They forced unknowing urinators to spend their pennies in one of 3 urinals that was closest to a single stall. A Confederate who was in on the experiment either stood directly next to the experimental subjects, 1 urinal away, or was not present at all. The findings of the experimental version of the pilot study confirmed the pilot with no one present. Urinators' average onset was 4.8 seconds, with the Confederate present 1 urinal away. That became 6.2. Finally, with the Confederate, the next urinal, it was 8.4. So this is a highly unethical study, but again, you really kind of on some level have to admire just the means of getting this information, despite the fact that they got it in a really creepy way. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we will talk some more about observational research in the next lecture.